Hello, welcome. Good afternoon. Very glad that you're here because I understand it's very sunny outside. Very tempting to be outside on the terrace and not sit inside, so I'm very glad that you're here. And also for people who are watching today or later via the live stream, welcome. You're here at the Holland Festival that we do a program here in the Balie Incorporation. And this program is named The Art of Violence. And we're going to speak with two directors, one who is part of the Holland Festival and one great director from the Netherlands, who are going to speak about how they show violence in their work, how they do that, why should you show it and in what way. And I think there are very interesting parallels between them, but also differences. But first we're going to listen to an introduction by Wieteke van Zeil. And she will take us through the art history of showing violence as an introduction to the conversation later. So I'm very glad that she's here. She's an art historian, a journalist and an art critic. I think you probably know her from her weekly column in the Volkskrant magazine. It's called Oog voor Detail, Eye for Detail. But she also wrote a couple of books about how to look at art, such as Dichterbij en Altijd iets te vinden. So the floor is yours and thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Marlijn, for the introduction, and also for me, thank you very much for being here on this tropical afternoon. Let me just see if this works. Well, yeah. So, visual art and violence. It was some years ago, almost 10 years ago, that I was on a short trip with my family in Rome, that I was quite boldly confronted with the limitations of my own perspective. Sorry. Oh. So I'm staying here. I'm a very movable person, but that I was quite boldly confronted with the limitations of my own view, my own perspective. I was standing in the Palazzo Barberini in front of a Caravaggio, this painting that you see here, and on my left hip I was holding my then 4-year-old daughter. And as I was watching the artwork and contemplating the depth of the red colors and the unsurpassed use of light and darkness of the artist and the intensity of the gaze of the women, my daughter, she took one look, and then she buried her head in my neck and said, "Mom, get me out of here. Get me out of here. I want to go. So I saw beauty and she saw horror. And then I took her out of the room, of course, because she couldn't handle it. And I realized that I didn't notice the intensity of the cruelty and violence that Caravaggio depicted. This is a scene that you can see many times in art history, Western art history, of the beheading of the army captain Holofernes by the biblical hero Judith. Here's another example that I would like to show you just a few years later, made by a female artist, Artemisia Gentileschi. And in a lot of ways they are similar because, for example, the murderess, Judith, is holding her hands straight. So she's trying to keep her own crime at a distance, almost as if, well, obviously she's not an experienced murderer. She doesn't want to do this. She's repulsed by what she's doing. But I noticed one detail that was completely different from the Caravaggio. And I write about details, so this is what I wanted to focus on for my next text. And that was actually quite telling. There were blood spatters of Holofernes on the beautiful satin dress of Judith, and also on her breast. And this made me feel like it was so physical, so fleshy and real and close, that it almost reminds of how a tiger is eating a prey and like burying his head in the deer and being covered with the blood. She was soiled by what she was doing. I was thinking when I saw it of this movie that you might know from Quentin Tarantino, True Romance, where this character, Alabama, played by Patricia Arquette, is killing James Gandolfini, and she's just completely covered in his blood, and they almost become one in this rage of killing. Well, so there I was. It wasn't that smart to bring my 4-year-old daughter to that, but here I was with my experience of writing about art, with my weekly visits to museums, and it was my young daughter that showed me actually an extremely essential part of what art is, and that is that art from all times, in all cultures, all continents, is always meant to feel like it's alive, and it felt like it was real and alive for her. So that is actually the power of many visual artworks, that it's made of material like paint or glass or wood, and still we believe that we see something that is real, and it has an emotional impact on us that, for instance, a chair or a car or a table would never have on us. Although maybe people might think different about cars, but but it's that material that comes alive in the artwork. This is actually something that is portrayed beautifully in archetypical stories, like Pygmalion, the sculpture that fell in love with his own sculpture and prayed to the gods that she became alive so he could live with her, or the other way around, that the story of Medusa, in which was that the image of Medusa was so powerful that anyone who would look at her would turn into stone and would freeze. So these are beautiful stories about the power of what art can be, and how art can be something that actually you can get a relationship with, a human emotion interrelationship with. So I would like to show you, it's a little bit jumpy because I'm going to show a lot of artworks from different times and different places about extreme violence in art. Because when we are confronted with something that is extremely violent, the first thing that we might do is want to look away. That we can feel perplexed or baffled, or in Dutch I would say verbijsterd, which is an emotion that's very complex, because on the one hand we want to turn our gaze away, and on the other hand we want to see it. We're fascinated, we're drawn to it. So artists know this, and they work through it and create their works with this theme. In the Western art, especially the art of the lowlands, Hieronymus Bos is one of the most important painters that depicted our extreme violence. What is interesting is that sometimes it seems like he took the images that he saw outside in the real world, like we could see this in the news, a decapitated blindfolded man on a stick, and then mixed it with the fears and the imagination that people had about hell and about the devil, with all these demons. Oh, see, I have a pointer. With all these little monstrous demons. So he mixed those fears of the people watching with reality that was actually surrounding them. But sometimes there is a lot of violence, like heavy violence, and it's not really there. And funny enough, that's often when it's about female violence. I'm giving you an example here of violence that is portrayed in such a way that beauty is just taking over, and it's almost not there. This is a scene that's called Virgo inter Virginis. It's the Virgin Mary surrounded by female saints. And all these saints have in common that they've been killed for their faith. This history of Catholic female saints also reads as a history of misogyny, because all the women have been killed by men, most of the time because they wanted to make a choice, and that wasn't accepted. So, but what you see here is beautiful women, like young women with extremely rich clothes and fabric and jewelry, and there is no trace of violence whatsoever until you look at the fashion and the jewelry. So what they did was the attributes of the saints, which is most of the time the things that they were tortured to death with, are just worked in the fashion. For instance, Saint Barbara here has a velvet cloak with gold thread towers, and the towers refer to the tower that her dad built to bury her alive and starve her to death. So that's really weird way. Sometimes it gets so twisted, and here's another. I don't know where it's pointed. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Here's another example in a beautiful satin dress of Saint Catherine. Saint Catherine was one of the smartest women of her time. It was told of her that she was so educated that she could easily wipe 50 of the best orators of the country away. But the emperor in her time wanted to marry her, and she said, no, thank you, I'm with God. And then he said, okay, I'm going to kill you. So he took these horrible wheels with spikes and knives and put her in between and wanted to kill her. But of course, God was with her, so the wheels fell apart. And these are the wheels that you see here with pearls on satin. So it's kind of twisted, and it makes us think about the position that women could be portrayed in. Then the emperor said, okay, you're not dead. Do you now want to marry me? And she said, no, I told you my loyalty is with Jesus. And then he decapitated her. So I'm going to take a glass of water. And then we go on to the next one. Oh, thank you. So, verbijstering, being perplexed. I told you I sometimes miss it because you're so conditioned in your view of art, but sometimes you get confronted with it. And I want to give you two examples of extreme violence by two artists from completely different times and continents. Afterwards, there are more examples, but these two have something in common, and that is the fact that what they made, what I'm going to show you here, they never made it to be published. So that's good to keep in mind, that actually there might be something going on, that it's difficult to give it to the world, which is understandable. So 2 years ago, in Switzerland, I saw an overview of the artist Francisco de Goya, large overview with a lot of portraits. And there was one room with prints from his series, Los Desastres de la Guerra, which he was a witness of the Spanish Independence War, which started in 1808. And he portrayed the cruelties and the horrific violence that he saw there in these works. And well, it's not real, it's etchings, it's material, but I can actually give you a warning here because it's very, very heavy to see if you take time for it and if you take your attention to it. So people are torn apart, women are raped, children are killed, priests are tortured. It's not nice to look at. Why did he do that? Why does he want to give that to, well, he didn't want to give it to the world, but why did he feel the urge to depict that and portray it? And so in the museum something happens, that reflex of perplexity that wants us, that we have the reflex to look away. It was almost as if the curators of the museum knew that we had that. So what they did, they found a solution for that, which was very smart. That in that room, with all these prints that were so overwhelming, there was one painting. And it was not a painting from that series. It was a late self-portrait of Goya. And what that portrait does is the opposite of the effect of the prints. Because he looks at us with a very calm, very direct gaze, very experienced gaze, you would almost say, as if to say, I saw this, these eyes saw this. And he draws us in, he makes us part of that part of humanity that we don't want to look at. So that was a very smart way to get us closer to that. So there are a few questions. Why would he make that? In the catalogue, I read a very interesting article by an Irish writer, Colm Toibin, who posed an interesting question. He said, was Goya overwhelmed by what he saw? And did it change his worldview, or was he drawn to it? In the first place, he would have been that painter that painted the elite, portrayed the elite, and then the war happened, and his worldview just turned. He had to change his way of working. He had to use his skills to show what he did. In the second place, was he drawn to it? His mind would have been at war, Colm Toibin writes, all the time, and he would have only recognized the reality collided with or merged with his mind that he always had, that chaos and feeling of destruction in his mind. And in that case, these artworks are merely a coming together of the reality and his mind. So by pure coincidence, I went home by train from Switzerland, stepped out in Frankfurt, where there was an exhibition of the contemporary American artist Kara Walker. You might have seen it because the exhibition has also been in Tilburg last year in the Pont. Kara Walker is a completely different artist, a different gender, different continent, different century. But she, also from her, there were works, 650 works that she made in a period of 30 years. And it reflects on the history, American history of suppression of black people, of racism, of the system that creates so much destruction. They're very, very personal. She never wanted to show them. And this is the first time she chose it. And they are also pretty extreme. There was actually a trigger warning at the exhibition. I thought it was a bit weird, a trigger warning in a museum. Like, museums should be the place where there's unlimited imagination. But when I entered the exhibition, I saw all these drawings so close together, and every drawing was just demanding your attention. I was actually glad that I didn't take my daughter, even though she's 13 now. As you can see, she also draws from art history. You might, if you're familiar with the work of Picasso, you might recognize a little bit the Guernica, which is, of course, also a very violent work about civil war. But what you see here is also drawn from history and reality, and it's heavy. It's kids that are tortured. It's a lot of sexual violence. It's women hanging with their intestines out of their vaginas. There's a lot of sadist violence in it. There's men hanging from trees, people being decapitated. It's hard to swallow, to look at. I'm sorry, I don't. Yeah, one little drawing that I found really beautiful is a black woman who was rolling up the mountain, the head of a white man, like Sisyphus in the Greek myth, where he has to roll up the stone up the mountain, and it rolls off again, and he has to do it again, as if it's endless. It will never stop. So there's this feeling of extreme frustration. How long is this going to take? So much more, I realized when I was looking at that, than representation. It's a reflection. It's a reflection on human behavior. It's a reflection on what people can do to each other. And artists use their skills to translate those images into their works. And they do it in several ways. And I want to show you some more of these, because it can have a different effect on how we relate ourselves to the topics that they show. For instance, this is the work by Natasha Kensmil, Dutch artist that last year has won the Johannes Vermeer Prize, the biggest art prize in the Netherlands. Rightfully so, because her work is absolutely amazing. She makes, among other things, she made a series referring to Dutch 17th century regions, like the powerful people in the 17th century that have been portrayed by the big artists from the 17th century, and that are always so glorified and polished and beautiful. And then what she does is she changes the palette, she changes the color, and she changes the material. It's almost as if it crumbles. It's almost as if it melts in front of her eyes. So to say that the history that we have created, our set idea of history, is crumbling before our eyes. There was one journalist in a podcast that said it's like these regions went to the upside down, for people who watched Stranger Things. It's like the reverse side, the dark side of this powerful beginning of capitalism, this system that just extracted so much and put so much violence on other people. So she makes us think of that without portraying literal violence, which is interesting, because I think these are really violent works. Big jump to 3 ages before. So what we might feel when you look is that collision of, is it beautiful or am I horrified? And can we experience that together? Is it possible to have these opposite feelings together when you look at an artwork? Rubens, for me, was a long, long time an artist that I did not understand. It was too big, it was too chaotic, it was too stormy. The colors were, I couldn't focus. It's like you can't focus on his paintings because they're so big. This is a very big painting, and I didn't feel that much. I knew it was a legend. The legend is a founding legend of Rome, the rape of the Sabine women. And then I saw this detail. And it was as if you see something that you know happens every day, everywhere. And many of us know women who this has happened to. She's grabbed from all sides. She can't go anywhere by more people, and she wants to get away. And how do we know that? Because her head is trying to get away. The only thing that she can move, that she has the freedom to move, is trying to get away. It's almost like an animal, and you see it in her face. And I was really struck by this. The moment I saw this, it has just been in the news that in Cologne on New Year's Eve, 500 women had been, this was 2016, had been harassed on this square. You might remember that news, but it's news that happens everywhere and that we read in the newspaper every day. And I was so struck that an artist that I didn't even like in the first place, but 400 years ago could have painted something from a perspective that was not his own. It's a female perspective. The pain that a woman can feel and the fear that a woman can feel when she's violated like that. And it's extra interesting because this rape of the Sabine women is mostly depicted by artists in a way that beauty is suppressing the violence. It's the beauty that counts. If for instance, with the, of course, beautiful statue of Gian Bologna in Florence, the Romans are naked. Why? The women are naked. Why? And they're moving like they're almost in a dance. They love it. So I think it's a very confusing image because it doesn't do right to the essence of the feelings in the story. Big jump, because this is also, it's not violence, it's a trace of violence. So how can we find this beautiful? It's difficult to answer. I don't think an answer is necessary either. It's good to think about it. This is a young artist. She died, unfortunately, very young, a Cuban artist, Ana Mendieta. And she made a lot of work, performance and photos about femicide, about violence against women. And what she did here in a performance, and these photos were made of it, was she lay naked on the floor, covered by blood, and covered by a sheet. And with that, she shows the anonymity of the women that this happens to, the fact that the perpetrators hardly ever get caught or punished for what they do. And so many women have this fate, and we don't see their faces, we don't see their names. So in a sense, this is a very real photo or depiction of violence that we recognize. But on the other hand, there's this one part that I thought was so beautiful. She refers to something, to a little biblical story. And that is the story of Veronica. When she saw Jesus right before he died, right before he went to the cross, she had a handkerchief with her. And she gave it to him, and he dapped his face with it. And when she got the handkerchief back, the face of Jesus was on the handkerchief. And that was the opposite of anonymity. That was a proof. That was proof of the violence against Jesus. So in a sense, when she lifts that sheet and you see the print of her body, it's proof. It's proof that it's there, the violence. So the archetypical story of violence that we want to look at and want to look away from is Jesus Christ, of course, in the Western world of art history and in the Christian religion, especially this type of painting. It's called the Man of Sorrows, because here's happening that dilemma, that paradox that I talked about with my daughter, that I talked about with Goya, and that is that it's hard to look at him because the violence in his face, the violence of what happened to him is very, very visible. The crown of thorns is really pushed like for centimeters in his head, so it's hard to look at. And Josiah, the prophet, wrote, even in the Old Testament, that Jesus was a man that you want to turn your face away from. Why? Because you feel the shame when you look at him. But why are these paintings made within the religious story to say, I suffered this, so you can suffer it. I carry this, so you can get through your pain. And this is a way used in art to make it transcendent, to give someone the feeling that he can carry his own pain, so that he connects his own feeling of the depth of the caves of his destructive mind to what happened to Jesus. So I would like to finish with, in terms of looking at violence in art, and also the feelings that we can have with it, and the collision of beauty and horror, with words of a writer that I admire very much, and that wrote a beautiful essay in the New York Times 2 years ago, I think, and it's called "In Dark Times, I Sought Out the Turmoil of Caravaggio's Paintings." So we're going back to Caravaggio. It's from Teju Cole, a Nigerian-born American writer. And he writes about Caravaggio. He had this trip and he looked at all these paintings, but he also was in Sicily at the lowest moment. Well, we're still in that low moment of the refugee crisis. So what he saw around him reminded him of the feelings of exile and of the horrors. And then he looked at the painting. And Caravaggio was in exile himself in Sicily at the end of his life when he painted this. And so Teju Cole writes, Caravaggio is long dead, as are his victims. He killed a man himself. What remains is the work, and I don't have to love him to know that I need to know what he knows. The knowledge that hums centuries later on the surface of his paintings. The knowledge of pain, of loneliness, of beauty, of fear, and of the awful vulnerability our bodies have in common. So, with this, I hope that I gave you some visual examples to take away in your thoughts in the conversation that follows with the two directors. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's a lot of thoughts, a lot of images that we can take along. So I would like to introduce our two next speakers, Lisaboa Houbrechts and Abdel Daoudi. They can come and sit here. Oh, yeah, you're there. Switch the microphone. Yes, proper introduction. Lisaboa Houbrechts is a Flemish writer and one of the theater directors of this year's Holland Festival. Welcome. I think people have seen or might see Vaker Poest of Hoe God Verdween. Very impressive. I saw it yesterday night. Inspired on your family's history. Oh, yeah. And I think, it's good to say that since 2022, you are a resident director at Toneelhuis in Antwerp. Welcome. And Abdel Daoudi is one of the permanent theater directors of Toneelschuur Productions in Haarlem. One of your works is History of Violence, an adaptation of the novel of Edouard Louis. And it's good to say that, like last week, there was the best performances in the Netherlands from last year, and it was top 4 in the number 4. But you also made a couple of other performances, such as Antigone, El Mektoub, and Macbeth. And I think you could say that most of your work is about injustice and sometimes related to violence, if I say it correctly. Yeah. We just listened to a lot. We saw a lot of images, and I had a lot of questions in my mind to pop up. But maybe to start with you, Lisaboa, Wieteke just said, there are a lot of people who, if they see violence, they try to get away, or they look away in a way. And you have some people, and maybe artists, who are drawn to it in a certain way. Would you say that that's also for you?
Yes, in that sense, it's special to think, for example, in the Grandpa Poest, the story that the violence is so present in the work, but at the same time, it's not that you use it to install that the piece should be about the violence. It's often that you tell a story, or that things that have marked you in life have this kind of violence in it, and that in the theater or in the work, it's more like, in a way, also how to avoid making it too concrete on stage, because we've seen so many pieces and so many beautiful, inspiring paintings where it's really the subject. In the story I wanted to tell, I had the feeling that I had a lot of love also for the aggressors, also for the people who we can consider to be aggressors, and how we can create a kind of space of, almost as Bach wrote, on the erbarme, on the pitié, onto what it is to go into into the sympathy almost, or into the empathy with somebody who does something that is unforgivable, and in a way to heal pain conflicted on maybe victims. So it was in a way also how could we transform this violence or this pain in something that could transgress it, so that it's not only the fascination or obsession with showing the scar, but more like the beauty of the scar.
Yeah. So you say violence is not the starting point; it's part of something that I would like to tell, and it's there, and it's more about how to overcome it in a way, or to make it transgressive. It's a lot to start with. How's that for you, Abdel? Do you like? I was thinking, like, if looking at all the paintings, would you say that? Do you feel that you're part of this tradition, or do you say, like, my work is something else than all the pictures that we just saw and the artists who try to depict something?
Yeah, I think in a way we reflect both in our own ways differently to the work. I feel I have always a difficulty looking to these pictures and these images, because as suggested, I find them aesthetically pleasing, but they're horrified, and the amount of I had difficulties looking at them because they were so much, and they were eating me. They were hurting me instead. And mostly with my work, the violence usually is the starting point, but from a point of view that I want to understand why the violence is there, and to deconstruct it in order to understand it and why it's happening, and why it's happening to particular people. So in a way, it is a starting point, but I try never to let it drown in aesthetics. In a way. So it's about deconstruction and making and understanding it in order to reflect on it, and because of one thing we know about violence is that it's cyclical and it's very contagious, and I think only in understanding why things happen and why aggressors, as Lisaboa just mentioned, are aggressors, is understanding what they've been through in order to go through the violence.
Yeah, and is that also that you said, like, that you say actually maybe violence, or what violence is a bit misunderstood in our society, or that people don't understand where it comes from? Is that also a reason why you think I should tell this story? I should deconstruct it in a way? Because we were also speaking about, like, Wieteke was speaking about violence that's really in your face and really physical in a way. Yeah. But I also really like the painting where you didn't see the violence, but it's still there.
Yeah, I think we are very focused on the physical violence, the violence that we see, the violence that leaves visible marks in a way, and that we're just starting to understand about the symbolic and systemic violence that you don't see, but that you have to talk and interact with people in order to understand and feel what other parts of violence they might have endured that are not visible, but is responsible for, as I just said, the cyclical system of violence, and ending up in physical violence.
Yeah. Do you recognize that?
Yes, and also I think it has also to do with what is in artwork and what is, for example, a picture you see in the paper, like Susan Sontag wrote this beautiful reflection and essays also on how to portray violence. But I think indeed, I once was working around the archive material of the Second World War, the concentration camps, because we were working one day with Fabrizio Cassol on the work about Roma musicians and their history while they were singing the madrigals of Monteverdi, and was also trying to find a connection with the beauty of the madrigals, and then how can we put this story into the work. For me, it was also a bit difficult, because who are you to to show this kind of violence. It is also not part of my own story, but their story, and how can you direct it? So it's also the question, like, who is the artist and why? But it was interesting in a way to evoke it in an abstract way, that it touches more than when you would just see the picture. We had then, for example, this archive material, and we just started with painting all the figures white, but in a way that they were like erased from the picture. And just this process of seeing one by one being erased under a madrigal, it talked so much more about mass murder, about mass graves, than if we would have really shown the picture of the mass grave itself. And so it's also about, in art, I think about the creativity you have to show violence in an abstract way. And it's a bit perverse in a way that you are looking for abstraction or concepts in it that evoke violence or inner experiences of violence, than rather showing just plain as it is, which is maybe more honest and maybe more clear.
And how do you, as director, try to keep that balance? Which you say it's a bit part perverse, and you could also say like, we have to show it as it is. We should not make it more abstract or more beautiful.
Or, yeah. It's a very thin line. I think for me, at that moment, it was more about the tone of the piece. That I knew if the way we taught it and with the people on the stage and the whole process, and I knew that the tone was right. In a way, but it's
and
not.
It's really intuitive in a way. Or
it's, yeah, it's not to be so measured in an objective way or something. It's so impossible. But you have to. Yeah, at the end, you make it for yourself this way, and you see how people react. I don't know how is it for you? How do you measure this thin line of?
In a way, I find it very difficult, because I was, for example, for the history of violence, I wanted to portray I wanted to be truthful, and I wanted to, and for one thing, I wanted to portray the beautiful gathering of these two men in the first part, and I wanted to give it justice, and then I had to be true, so I cannot look away for the cruel violence that happened afterward. And I was also torn between my job as a director, because I think we have a responsibility of what we show to the audience.
And is that a responsibility towards the audience, or also towards your people that you're working with in a way?
Both, in a way. You have a responsibility to the people you work with, but that, the work and the creating of violence with actors is they know they know the story, and they know what they step into. But I think there's a really, I think as artists we have a big responsibility by to our audience to be careful in order what we show them, because that is part of the discourse we're creating, and how we see violence and how we talk about it, and just to portray it as I think we have to be a little bit careful with perversity.
And why?
Because why? Because we have a responsibility. I think there is already so much violence in the world that it really has to be, that we need to have an objective with it, because of why we're showing it, and not just showing it for the aesthetical reason or just to be truthful. I think truthfulness is not enough, and that as an artist should say something and have a meaning with it, and has an objective of why to put people through this intense, horrible images that you are showing them, in order to either understand or break this cyclical violence, or understand underlaying violence more than the physicality of it.
And do you think that there's if you look at theater or at the discipline you're working in, that there is a lot of showing violence, be it physical violence or non-physical violence, that there's a lot of that on stage without a purpose in a way, or without?
I think so. For example, in film or entertainment, you see it a lot, and there's also, it's interesting, this big joy of playing the most cruel moments. I mean, when you're when I studied as an actress, I really enjoyed playing the mad characters. You know? It was something that you feel that it has a lot of flesh on it, and you can play insanity. I mean, when I was working with the children for Grandpapoes, yeah, they just they just overact also a little bit the violence.
They enjoy it. Because they enjoy, you say that they enjoyed it as well?
They can enjoy it to go into a room and just scream like, and like go into the depression, and they're kids of 10 years old. It's so interesting. It's so in the human to like when we go act, it is something ritual also. Like you transgress. It's like it has something indeed. Like if you look at the Greek tragedies. It would be full of trigger warnings today if you would write a Greek tragedy today, because it's full of like Medea killing her own children. But then it was really also linked to something ritual that for Medea, when she kills the children, she becomes divine. It's like a sacrifice. There's this difference between killing and sacrifice that was maybe in the Greek culture very much to be felt. Today, a sacrifice is something.
All these stories have like great violence in it, but never shown on stage. There were always people, someone coming up on stage and telling or retelling of the violence they saw and they witnessed.
That's very interesting. Yeah? I find it the bode, or somebody's coming in to tell what happened in this room and has the most beautiful words to describe this most horrible act, but you don't see it. It was much more abstract also in the Greek tragedies with the masks, and it was very far. If you were at the back row in the Greek theater, like so many people, you don't see. You only see little dots. So you only have the words. Yeah.
But you also stepped in a bit in that tradition of not showing everything, because actually in one of the first scene of your play, there's a rape scene between a priest and a child, but you hear it as an audience, but you don't see it.
You don't see it. Yes, that was a choice. It was it was a clear choice. It happened actually because I was once working with some singers on a piece, and it was during during the lockdown, and we had invited some audience to come and see our tryout, but it was forbidden, and the police like surrounded the theater, and we were singing, and we had to stop it, and then everybody had to leave the hall. It was police intervention. It was quite hard, and after this we wanted to continue, and the main singer, she got a panic attack. She was singing the Monteverdi, and suddenly she ran off stage, but the microphone was still on, and she had a very serious panic attack. And I was sitting in the hall, and I was sitting there, and it was like completely destroyed from the inside for me to just hear this. And she was backstage, and one of the technicians tried to calm her down and said, like, just breathe, and was counting with her, and everything was to be heard because the microphone was still on. And when I was sitting there, I thought, wow, this is much more effect than if I would see it. And then the piece I made after that was Grandpapoes with the children, and then the impossibility, of course, of really showing it with kids that are 10 years old. Then I had this memory that came back of this impression that I had that day, and then I thought, let's try it. That you only have it as a soundscape, and in a way it works more effectively than when you would see it. But it's a little bit perverse to say it, but I say like it's like effect.
Yeah, sure.
But the effect is there to, I don't know, to tell the story that you do with the honest way, or that you do with your full heart, but you need somehow, you're still thinking of effect.
Because this sounds like a very smart but also cool director's trick, because in a way the performance or the depiction of the performance or what's happening is always happening in the people's minds and in the minds of the audience, and what people can think of is way more perverse or more violent or more beautiful than we can show on stage. So in a way, this is a very nice example of using your audience in order to create what you want on
Yes.
stage.
Yeah. Maybe it's a good part to go to a scene from your performance. It's the second clip, Robin, not the first one, because it's based on a book, and the book is all about a guy who he meets somebody on the street, he invites him to his home, and then it becomes more violent in a way. That's all what I tell. But I think the moment that the rape is happening. It's in the book. It's really central, and it works around it, and I think in your performance too. So we're gonna watch a short clip of that.
I see it in your eyes. I hardly feel alive. Can't begin to say that I do love you.
Ik ga je vlekken geven! Fuck! Ik ga je vlekken geven! 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 Ik ga je vlekken geven!
Mijn gezicht wordt tegen de grens. Deze laten
Wat smaak is gepest! Het ruikt naar perzikgeur! Niet naar perzik, maar naar perzikgeur! Ik blijf hardnekkig proberen zijn handen aan elkaar vast te binden met mijn sjaal. Dit levert niks op, dus ik grijp naar het pistool. Hij schreeuwt niet. Uit angst voor mijn revolver. Mijn bekken slaat tegen hem aan. Dof. Droog. Als hij te veel weerstand biedt, moedigt hij me aan. Dus verzet hij zich net genoeg, zonder al te fel te zijn. Hij houdt het geluid van echte pijn binnen. Het geluid wat hij maakt is namaakpijn. Doseert zijn schokken en kreunen zo min mogelijk pijn, zo snel mogelijk tot een einde te komen. Het ruikt naar perzikgeur. Niet naar perzik, maar naar perzikgeur. En naar mij. Alles ruikt naar mij. Alles is mij. Ik lig hier bovenop hem, maar ik ben ook het kussen. Het donker, het blauwe streepjeslicht, de lakens. Dan stuiptrekkingen en sidderingen. Ik word stijver, dikker, het wordt pijnlijker voor hem. Zijn verzet wordt heviger voor mijn genot. Het geluid van mijn bekken versnelt. Ik bereik een hoogtepunt en precies op dat moment beukt hij zijn elleboog tegen mijn ribben. Ik val op mijn rug, hij rent naar de overloop en ik lig daar op de grond. Met mijn geslacht nog hard. Recht als een pauw. Plotseling lachwekkend eigenlijk. Niets meer dan een stukje rozeachtig vlees, onhandig op mijn lichaam geplant, met bloed bedekt. Bloed. Dat ook kronkelt langs zijn dijen.
Ik moet echt weggaan nu, anders zet ik een keel op.
Nee, fuck! Niet doen.
Of course, it's a registration, so it's not as in the real experience in the theater. But
Yeah.
I was thinking how this is, of course, a bit of the core of the play in a way, a central part of it. How did you go about to think about like how you show it, what choices you made?
Yeah, this is one of the choices in the performance where I deviated from Edouard Louis' work, because the story is constructed that Edouard Louis goes to his sister after everything happens, and we hear the story as a narration of his sister telling her husband what Edouard Louis told her 4 days ago, what happened a couple of weeks ago. So it's a narration of a narration. So for this performance, as you can see, I worked with 3 actors, Eelco Spits, who played beautifully Edouard Louis, and Lotte Dunselman, his sister Clara, and Reda. And the only one, and the performance is built up, this is the central point of the performance where the rape happens, but we go non-linear and fragmental towards that process, and try to deconstruct every time we come to a new part of the puzzle, or of the events leading up to the event. We deconstruct it, and Edouard Louis and Clara reflect upon it. So they are both in the reflective domain of what happened that night and the nights after. And they can think about it, and they can talk about it, and they can give their opinion about it. The only one who cannot reflect is Reda, the one who's the victim. The one who was the aggressor on that particular night. And we never hear him reflect on what happens. And all that we know from the words of Edouard Louis. So in the performance, he also never comes in the reflective domain. So he remains always a subject in the narration of Edouard Louis, and in the narration of his sister. So in a way, he becomes in this story powerless. He's just a subject, and he moves in a way how people talk about him. And Louis talks also very beautifully about him. And in the performance, I was thinking, how are we going to construct the rape scene? Because of what I said earlier, I want it to be more than just a physical and aesthetical rape scene. This is the only time in the performance, as you just saw, where he enters the reflective domain, and he can address the audience. And he can address the audience directly. So very cruelly, also taking over the story where Edouard Louis wants to reclaim his own story, because the story goes about reclaiming your own, reclaiming and having the power of retelling your story in your own way. And at this point, at the center of where the violence is, we tried to Reda again take over the narrative and the story while Edouard is retelling it. But so in a way, this is also a very aggressive way to take the story in manner of his own hands. But also in a way, we let him take responsibility for his own actions, because he needs to speak them out loud, what he did and how he portrayed, and what he did there. As Reda. So it's both very violent, as in a constructual level of the story, and also finally letting him out of of just being the subject, and giving him a voice of his own, and taking therefore the power, but also the responsibility of his actions in that way.
Yeah, and is it also that you feel that it is important that that you as an audience maybe make a start in understanding why he's doing that, and does it help to let him speak then himself?
No, because I think the understanding of why he did what he did, and how he came to this, that's been given us by Edouard Louis.
Yeah.
So he paints this picture of the narrative and creating a story of understanding and deconstructing the not only his violence that that Edouard Louis felt when he grew up and reflects on and sees in the eyes of Reda, who has similarities by inducing internal homophobia and being an immigrant coming from a colonized country in France, because Reda is from Algeria. So that work has really been done by Edouard Louis. So for me, using Reda to take the responsibility of telling the rape himself and therefore capturing the narrative, not only because that's the most part of the violence, because all the rest of the story is told by Edouard Louis. As I don't know if you heard it, but he tries to begin he points the gun and he pulls his pants, and then he aggressively takes him over by voice. So this was really inspired by how to portray that violence of Reda.
Yeah. It's interesting because actually I heard in the interview that you said that like the performance that you made about Vakkerpoes, that it actually started in your head as a book. And I was thinking, because it's our both books that you, like it's a book that you portrayed on theater, and you in your head it started as a book, and then you decided to make a performance instead of writing it. And of course, you have so many extra elements that you can take in to tell this story. And with you, especially music is really important and really beautiful. And I was thinking, like, how do you, the relation between what you see and the violence that you see and the beauty of the music you hear, how did you bring that together in your head, or how did you want to bring that to the audience?
Yes, the music is a St. John's Passion of Bach, so it's also about the suffering of Jesus. But it's very beautiful.
Very much in line with all the pictures that we saw.
But the music is, Bach and his music, yes. It's interesting that everybody's talking about their sins in the music, like it's talking about to be forgiven, and what is the music for me? It was an interesting way of combining the divine, and also like when you listen to the music of Bach, you almost get a little bit religious, almost from yourself. That has a very strong impact. So you have this divine layer in the music, something really beautiful. But at the same time, if you connect it with scenes that are a little bit dirty, or with scenes that are a little bit, for example, Grandpa Poes is a collector of cats, and so he's also busy, like the cat has to go to shit on a good spot, and he's talking about that. And so if you have a piece of Bach music that is so divine, and at the same time he is struggling with that, it's a very beautiful counterpoint. And it almost becomes funny, and at the same time, then you have the cats become also pedigree cats. So it is about the race, and that the race has to be very pure. And then you see that it's a metaphor for Nazism that's starting to that is being influenced by during the performance. So in this way, the music helped me to create a counterpoint, and then characters could switch from what you could say morally right to morally wrong, and it could become funny and tragic at the same time. So the music helped me to create all these different kind of feelings towards it. And
but if we focus on the more, because it's the topic of this afternoon's talk, so I'm just going back to this violence. Wieteke was saying with one of the statues, he said, like, here the beauty is almost suppressing the violence. And I was thinking about some scenes where the music and the violence is really contrasting in a way, or it's at least both very there. There's, of course, a risk that people could say, like, the music is, the beauty of the music is maybe suppressing the violence.
Yes, it's again like a kind of objectivity, or a kind of, you cannot measure this.
No.
I mean, it's like I don't know. It's also not when you make an image like that I understand the image. It's just something happens, and when you create a theater work, you know, you want to have be close to that something happens without understanding it, or without having a meetlat or something to measure, like now it goes too much to there or there. But yes, is the music suppressing the violence? Yes, is it making it
I'm not saying that it is, but I'm more about like how do you make sure that you're not aestheticizing the violence that you show on stage by, for example, using music that goes really like this, so that it also maybe helps a bit to see what you see.
It's interesting. I think here in this sense, I used to, for example, I used to erbarmen me dich under a scene of rape. But the scene of rape is not clear a rape, because it's a game between two men and a young boy, and who is like 16, 17, and a man that is I don't know, in his 40s, 50s, a man that came back from the working camps in Germany, and he was traumatized by what he's been through, and he's been sterilized there. He's made infertile, and he has a struggle with his own gender and sexuality, and he sees this boy and he falls in love with this boy. And they are playing a game of praying, but they are laughing with it, and you don't know. And then suddenly the erbarmen dich of Bach comes. So the music helps to create a connection with this man, to feel like almost sympathy for the man that is going to become an aggressor. And then you see like, is a very fluid zone where the playing becomes not nice, but still the young boy takes out his shirt, and you know he likes it in a way. And then at the moment there's a border being crossed, and the boy doesn't even know, and the man also not. And then suddenly he's lying on top of him, and it's happening, and suddenly the boy doesn't want it anymore, and so it's a very ambiguous terrain. And then with the music of the erbarmen dich, I had the feeling that in that way the music helped me to tell the story, to create a kind of sympathy, and to create a kind of, that there is a moral conflict, that we don't know anymore what is right or wrong, and that the music was a great translator of that.
Yeah.
I have a question. And what is the story that you wanted to communicate then? Because I'm sorry, I haven't seen your performance yet.
No. The story I want to communicate.
You just depicted a very, I think it looks like a very visual scene.
Yes.
And what is it that you want to communicate with this scene?
I was like, how can I stage this? Because it's all based upon memories in a way, like memories. I make a story where a main character is trying to go into the memory of the grandfather and the memory of the father. So she doesn't know, because, you know, sometimes you have stories and you think you judge the stories, but in a way you don't know the detail of the story. And she tries to go into the details. And while we were working on it, I wanted to make it more detailed in the sense of, I didn't want to portray people, the pederast, people like people who are only aggressive. I want to have almost that you could love them also. In that sense, I tried to recreate this kind of scene in order to understand it a bit better, and to go into the fluid borders, in order to tell the story in a way that I haven't seen so much before, or that I thought that would help me, would heal maybe the persons also on the stage, and the witnesses, because there's a little girl traveling through time seeing this. It could help her understand and heal her. And in a way, when she has seen this and she has seen this, okay, she can understand more or less, though it doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's beyond that. I mean, and then she gives it a place, and it's like healed, it's erased. Okay, we can go to another story. So it's about like, how can we erase memory in order to become free?
Cool.
I was thinking about, like, with going into these stories, making this, what did it learn you about, because both of the stories are so much about the cycle of violence and how it is intergenerational in a way, and that the person who has been violent, has been experiencing violence, is giving it through the next generation. it's of course a big question, but what do you think that helps to break this cycle of violence? Did it learn you something about that? Because you said a bit like maybe you used the word healing for describing the scene.
I don't know. It is like a huge thing. I don't know. In this little story, that is a little detail about the violence. It is such a big theme.
Yeah.
It's for this specific girl in this specific story. It is kind of liberating to leave the judgment. You know.
Yeah.
And to this ruimhartigheid. I don't know how to translate it.
Me neither, but
it's about also the crisis of forgiveness. You know?
Yeah,
the crisis of forgiveness that we are so much into right now. We have it's all. So we have such an essential, important debate nowadays, and you have also this cancel culture that also, which is probably in some cases very necessary. But the crisis of the forgiveness that. If you're not in a state that you don't, that the new generation, don't have to forgive an older generation, but that the word forgiveness kind of creates a kind of moral superiority, and you can like revenge by not forgiving, or you can be God by forgiving. And if you can put that aside and not going into judgment or not going into the principle of forgiveness, but just saying like going into understanding, maybe it can create. For this little girl, a way of not becoming an aggressor herself, or of not becoming bittered, or not becoming revengefulness.
Yeah.
I think the only reason that we can escape this terrible machine of violence is empathy, is radical empathy, is by understanding and trying to see past the violence and understanding why somebody is an aggressor, and not adding yourself to it, and to choose for something else, because where there is one thing, something different cannot be there. So when you choose empathy there, and you truly see and interact with people, then and you understand where somebody comes from, or where somebody has been through. So I think it goes a little bit further than forgiving, maybe.
Yeah.
And forgiveness might not even be necessary in my opinion. But when you understand and you truly connect with somebody and choose radical empathy, is when we stir away from the violence, and because in a way to look at somebody as an aggressor and just as an aggressor is a way of reduceren, is a way of deducing somebody just to one point, so that we can or that yourself can accept or what happened, and I think it's that deduction is terrible, and one of the small violences that creates a lawine of an effect with more and more violence. So I think it's steering away from deduction, and the only thing that you can do that is by empathy, and I think that's a great reason why we should keep creating stories like these stories, because the theater and art is a wonderful place where we can practice that like all the time, by seeing and understanding people and that are far away from us and look like us, but still are very close to us.
Yeah. How did actually people of the audience react to the plays, like to the different theater plays? And I was just thinking, like, I can also understand that maybe people sometimes are mad about it or feel very emotional about it. Or I was just curious how, if you had some reactions that really struck you.
emotional reactions. Yes, people sometimes come to tell the stories, or they come with their stories. Yes, but it's beautiful. I have the feeling after the show, like yesterday was beautiful here at the festival. People stand up and clap, and it's nice. It feels liberating. It feels beautiful, like something is shared, and then afterwards they look so happy when they clap, and then afterwards they come and they have a tragic story sometimes to tell, and it's like, but you were happy clapping, you know, and it's nice to tell the happiness, to see it, and like the kind of emotion you get is in a way kind of can be a relief for audience, maybe, I don't know, and afterwards too.
What I find the most beautiful. Most beautiful moment is just like after the performance is stopped, and we go into a blackout, and Eelco plays this very beautifully, that he chooses the people, his friends. He's been talking about Didier and Geoffroy always, and they stay with him during a night because he's scared, and we end with that moment. And after the blackout, this sudden death moment where the audience is not ready to. They know it's finished, but they're not ready to immediately clap or start the applause. And you feel this suspension. They're like, please give me one more few moments to internalize what we just saw, and I really cherish that moment because that. I love it when audience comes to a performance, and I love it myself when I see a performance that I don't want to react on it immediately, but just like, can I hold it just one more second and then think about it a few more moments and then breathe out. So that's the most thing.
Nice. Yeah. Are there maybe people from the audience who want to step in or have a question, or maybe Wieteke wants to react to? Yeah.
Okay, so, well, first I have to say that I have not seen neither of the performances, but if I understand well, like with this scene you describe of Bach music, it's like an abuse of an older person to a younger person.
Yeah.
And in your story, it's a bit of also some aggression. You both describe this idea of empathy towards the aggressor, to give the aggressor a human level, which I think is really, really good, to understand the whole complex of this person becoming an aggressor. But obviously, we also need to feel the empathy for the victim.
Yes.
Right? So this is also really important. Like I said, I've not seen it, so it's hard for me to judge it. But what I'm trying to say is that there might be also a big risk to show too much of a human level and to feel too much empathy for an aggressor, right? Because then we normalize that people can be aggressors, and but they all have a story and they all had traumas, and that's why they're expressing. Well, yeah, but is that we cannot justify this? I mean, I'm not saying that the stories do, but it's also really important to understand this, both sides, and well, yeah, like not to romanticize or glamorize too much this. I don't know what you guys think about this. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, I agree on that.
Yes, I totally agree, and it's for the topic of this of this today that we focused a lot on the aggression and on the scene of the aggressor. But I completely understand what you're saying, and for example, in the history of violence, it's the main focus is the victim, and he is the performance is dealing with his reclamation of his narration, because he's feeling that by telling his story and by going to the police and doing de aangifte. The declaration, by doing the declaration, going to the police and going to the judgment and telling this story to his friends, he feels that he's losing his story. So the main focus is reclaiming the narration of what happened to him, and by so understanding why it happened. So the part of the aggressor is a big part in understanding. But I totally agree with you that we should never.
I think also in a play or something that you don't choose sides, like in a sense you live with the victim and its tragedies and what he's going through, and you live with the aggressor and how he's going, and you give a little bit more the complex around it, rather than choosing the side, or that the theater doesn't become a moral space. That there's no moral message in the end. But I'm very intrigued by the idea of creating tragedies of today with no antagonist. Normally in a tragedy, it requires the bad guy and the good guy, or the antagonist and protagonist. But can you create a theater that's interesting, that's full of tension, that can be full of violence, without that there is an antagonist? This is a nice thinking exercise. Without that, it should be really exactly put like that in society of today. It's just like in this microcosmos that you create as a thinking exercise, as an artistic proposal, that it could be interesting to examine.
Well, yeah, I wanted to ask you, because there's this debate nowadays on art and media and the things they give us, like mainstream media mostly. How important do you think it is, you guys as directors, to have experienced the violence that you are trying to portray in order to make it genuine or real? Or because you see, we're talking about violence and it comes with representation, how truth is it really? Do you think there's a line? Do you have to have lived through the same violence that you're trying to depict? Or do you think you can also do it just with enough research and with enough like sharing experiences with other people? Because I can think of this, maybe it's just a little bit dumb, but I remember when the Jeffrey Epstein, the Jeffrey Dahmer thing came out, there was this whole thing about, okay, but who's talking about this story? Like, from whose point of view is this? And what's the point of it? And has anyone thought about the families having to relive this whole trauma and experience? Like, what's the point then if it's making more harm than good? And where's the line in you guys as directors and making this whole story? Because it's very important. Like, the things you do, even if they seem little, like details, can change the whole narrative. So how important do you think it is to like focus on that when you're creating something?
I think for me, in all the work that I do or try to make, I think that's very important. I create what I understand. So in a way, you have to know and you have to be aware of what I'm creating. So also a bit of a personal question, which I understand. Yeah, but in a way, I think that's. I need to think of the formulation of how I say this. We communicate. I try to communicate something that is algemeen. What's it called? General. Yeah, I don't want to communicate something general. So I appeal on the way every person feels injustice or sometimes feels violated or feels deducted. So that's the main focus. And when that's a form of violence that I understand. So that's why I choose to turn the narrative to that point of view. And in that way, I try to use other types of violence to incorporate and change the narrative in that sense of direction. But I very much agree with you when you say there's a responsibility in order to show what kind of narrative, and especially because there lies a power in who holds the narrative and what narrative it has been told. So, as a director, I very much choose very securely what people tell the story together with my team and with my actors as well, because I do nothing alone. So yeah, that's a very important thing that I take with, and again, I only try to make what I understand. I don't know how that's for you.
Yes, I think there are many questions in your question. That is very, very beautiful questions. Yes, I think it makes me reflect upon many things at the same time. What is private and what is personal, and what is the difference between private and personal? Art is a therapy, or art for art? That sometimes, you just also create stories because you take a distance. I think also, especially when you have lived through something, it's very necessary to also take the distance from it, because if it's only that when you go to the stage, it's maybe not enough, or it's maybe too full, maybe it's too much, and and you have to, I think, create a space where a lot of people can meet from the audience, but also on the people you put on stage. And as you said, you work with people. I think for me personally, there's always like a secret. I do things with a secret that you don't communicate, something that makes me wanting to do theater in the first place. It comes because of things happen in life and whatever. And the secret is always there. And you meet other people who also have a secret. And when the secrets go a little bit into resonance, you feel there's something in the air, and let's do it together, and we will talk about it, but not really concretely. And then, you touch each other, but you feel like we have to tell something together. And then then so many secrets are invited on the stage. Then you can work with people who are exactly the opposite of you, or can be very close to you. Or then you can create a very open environment where people can meet, and on the borders of all these stories that are collected there, you make a big cry together or something. And I think that then it goes. So that for me is like about representation and who can represent what. For me, it's still like the collectiveness of the art form, of that you make this kind of proposal together, and then it's about you meeting some other people and trying to create something together, instead of because you have lived through something now, and then that's why I can tell my story, and that's why it should only represent this. Then sometimes I have the feeling a bit that it becomes a bit narrow. And to be what is exercise in generosity, and how can you abandon yourself, and how can you take distance from your own life, and at the same time it can be in the middle of it. So yeah.
Thank you. I think we go to the sun, and I think we end up here officially, but we can continue the conversation outside or with a drink maybe. I would like to thank you very much for this conversation, and I would like to say that tonight there's another performance of Vakkenpoes. I don't know if it's already sold out or if I can still say to people, okay, go there, it's really beautiful. And I heard that your performance is coming back to the theater, right?
Yes, coming back in September during the theater festival here in Amsterdam, and in a few selective theaters in the country in September.
Yeah, so please check them out. And a big applause for you and also for Wieteke. And enjoy the rest of the Holland Festival.